Hello everybody, welcome to Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about Autechre and their third album, Repetae. Alright, Repetae, owner of the worst album cover of all time. This is like the end of the trilogy of the classic 90s Autechre albums. Like the beginning of a transition between their more conventional material and their more experimental stuff afterwards. It's an album that still very much belongs in the 90s and feels at home next to all their IDM cohorts. Not that far a cry from something like I Care Because You Do, for instance. But it feels like this was where they really started to define their identity. They became more easily recognizable and developed a feel to their work that you couldn't get out of any of their contemporaries. This album is very mechanical sounding, the kind of thing that they were trying to make it sound like it was coming out of, like, old factory equipment, trying to remove even more of the human element out of their music. Taking cues from industrial music, I suppose. Can get kinda harsh and pounding, not the kind of album for everyday listening. Yet, for some reason, I more consistently got into this one than I ever really got into Amber. I think the key element in this album that made it work for me is just the fact that despite how harsh and clanking it is, it's still catchy. I can pretty easily recall what most of these tracks sound like even when I'm not listening to them. This is something that I always have to mark as a positive, especially in a genre like this that relies so heavily on abstract construction, and catchiness is more of a rarity. It's certainly not an element that comes into play on basically any of their subsequent albums. And Repetae is catchy in a way that other albums aren't. Like, most of the time when a track gets stuck in my head is thanks to a lead melody sticking with me or central groove. There are melodies on this album, and they do form coherent harmonies and stuff, but they're never really the focus or the element you actually remember on any track here, maybe with the exception of Eutow, but that's about it. Everywhere else, the hook of any given track is in the percussion patterns. The repetitive ostinatos of clanking noises and banging metallic sounds are surprisingly what ends up sticking with me on most of these tracks. They're just unconventional enough to grab your attention, but not so much that they don't still create a driving and infectious groove. They become the hook. And that's not really something that any other album I know of off the top of my head really does. I also like how each of these tracks, despite all centering around some repetitive pattern that never really changes or evolves a lot throughout any given track, each of them just seems to continually build on those patterns, slowly adding a new layer to their mix every so often to prevent them from getting boring or wearing out their welcome. It's kind of like watching buildings being constructed right in front of you. Now, it's not like Mike Paradina's level layering. His mixes tend to build on themselves to a much greater extent and much faster than anything on here. This album is still fairly simplistic, and its progressions feel a lot more methodical and painstaking. But it all fits together in a way that still keeps me invested in basically all these tracks. Alright, I suppose I should discuss individual tracks. The opener, Dael, is a good tone setter and proof of concept. Lets you know right off the bat what Repetae is all about, with its lumbering, clanking patterns and tonal humming and whirring in the background forming a pseudo bass line. It's a catchy track. One that I can recall the tune to easily without actually listening to the album. That one sound just rings out so clearly in my mind, even though it doesn't really sound like what I just made it sound like. Clipper isn't nearly as catchy as most of the other tracks on here, but there is a bit more focus on more melodic textures, though even they all have a strong metallic quality to them. The bassy pads sound like engines revving up. Much of the percussion sounds like bursts of radio static and white noise. The ending on that one's a little drawn out, but still really nice. Leterel, though, that one bangs, quite literally. It slowly lumbers along as its patterns of kicks and banging noises slam down with so much force, contrasting with other patterns that sound like little ball bearings tapping together. While lots of chord pads gather around these patterns like clouds of fog, there's very little in the way of bass in this mix, and yet it still has one of the most solid and well-built grooves on the album. Pretty consistent favorite. Now then there's Rotar, and I'll admit this track is one of the two on this album that I never found to be a big highlight. Always found this one kind of forgettable. And even so, it's still pretty good. Its clanking percussion patterns don't form the strongest hook in the bunch. Their rhythms are a bit more conventionally placed than other ones on here. But they aren't not memorable. Whenever it comes up, I'm like, oh yeah, this one. And the melodic pads here, they're a bit thinner, more organ-like, I suppose. It's cool. There's just other tracks here that stick out a bit more in my mind. The next track, Stud, is a good example. Like, it's much less conventional 90s sounding, save for a couple of warbly, glassy textures that are like way in the background in a few parts. But the percussion is like this little rickety set of tiny little burst noises that sound like they're coming from some kind of electronic scanner that was invented in the 50s, or like a printer or something like that. There's just something, like, oddly familiar about, like, those percussion textures that I can't really put my finger on. And the kinda sorta 3/4 time it carries always made it stick out in my head. And the melody is carried by this tremolo-covered bass synth that actually kinda sounds like an actual bass guitar. Brings a strangely organic flavor to this track that helps make it go the extra mile for me. It is pretty long at 9.5 minutes and doesn't develop a ton, but I don't know, the core flavors that went into it were interesting and distinctive enough to keep me invested regardless. It's one that always just stuck in my mind. But then we get to Eutow, the one track here where the melodies are the main focus and do a good job of sticking with you. I mean, these lead pads are just absolutely huge sounding. These imposing chords, buzzing bass lines, and high-pitched leads wailing on top. It all comes together as this big monolithic blur that occasionally flickers out of existence in time with the beat and then collapses and rebuilds itself every 7th beat. The percussion on this track isn't anything to write home about, but thankfully the tune on top is more than enough to make up for it. I think this is the most popular pick for favorite on the album, and while I'm not totally sure if it's the pick I'd go with necessarily, since it's noticeably shorter than everything else on here and it zips by so quickly, it is certainly up there, and would have been my easy favorite if you asked me like 2 years ago. It still might be, I don't know, it depends on my mood. It is cut off rather abruptly by C/Puck, which is kind of more like lower stakes and laid back as if to directly contrast the intensity of the track before it. Maybe even kind of playful and quirky with all its clattering textures of various shapes and sizes. I thought I was going to mark this one as my least favorite going into starting work on this video, but I don't actually remember why. Maybe because of the abrupt non-transition that starts it, but honestly I do still like coming back to this one, and it does like have a few subtle moodier tinges to it in the melodies that are nice too. Now my least favorite is probably the next track, Knit. Some of the fluttery leads that pass around here and form the hook are kinda off-kilter in a less pleasant way. Even if there are some more like flute ones that come in later that I like more, though even those feel a little out of place on top of this thin and wobbly mix that sounds like it's struggling not to break down in a heap right in front of you. I don't know, still interesting, I don't really feel the urge to skip it, it's just not the most satisfying to listen to. Overhand, meanwhile, that's one I'm half and half over. On one hand, it's a track this album definitely needed. A much more like subtle ambient-ish piece that's almost completely beatless, based around a spooky melodic synth loop. There's some skittering and pattering percussion here too, but it's barely audible at all. The whole thing creates a really nice atmosphere. That said, there are also some high-pitched ringing lead textures that are like piercingly high-pitched and are kinda annoying, and make it harder for me to sign off on this one as a big favorite. I still appreciate its placement, and the ringing isn't so annoying that I feel the urge to skip it entirely. It's not like Ventolin level grading. And I suppose it helps the track feel more at home next to these other more mechanical sounding pieces next to it. Thankfully though, the closer here is quite strong. We finished with Rsdio. The percussion here is also kind of more subtle and thin, if still engaging thanks to this weird percussive honking tube-like noise driving the mix. I don't know how to properly describe that. But it does create some rollicking momentum, but there's also regular glassy bass stabs that envelop the mix. Doo-doo-doo, doo-doo-doo. And alien melodic textures bleeping around. The whole thing closing out a really texturally distinctive album in a fitting and satisfying way. This track is marked as over 10 minutes, and admittedly that's thanks to a fairly long fade out in silence at the end. It's probably more like 9:40 something. But whatever. Maybe that's where the surface noise on the vinyl version is supposed to go. The packaging on this thing says the album is incomplete without surface noise. But whatever, it's fine without that, obviously. So yeah, that's Repetae. Pretty great album, if I may say so myself. Far from perfect, like basically everything else Autechre have done, it's very much an album that needs a specific time and place, and for me to be in the right mood to resonate the most strongly with me. There have been a few listens of this thing while prepping for this video where it just felt too thin and repetitive to really click with me, but those haven't been happening as frequently as other albums these guys have put out. I can still get into this one much more consistently than most of their other stuff. It says something that I felt compelled to buy a CD. So, yeah, I guess that's about it. It is still a classic and a project that defined what this duo was all about, and they only ventured into stranger and more difficult territory afterwards. This is still pretty tame by their standards, so I'll take it. Pretty essential slice of IDM history here all the same, and one that still holds up as striking and memorable to this day. Good stuff. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.